In Easton, welcome. This is part two of my two-part presentation, my 60 years collecting 6 centuries of historical newspapers. So we're going to pick up we're going to do a little bit of a different thing today. We're going to start out by comparing some genres of collecting. And what I mean with this is to show you the difference between some of the earlier newspapers and how they were presented and how certain events that turned out to be really earth-shattering events were portrayed in the early papers. Now, most of us, of course, were alive when Armstrong was the first person to walk on the moon. And we're used to seeing newspapers with a big banner headline and a huge portrait. And if you notice that the newspapers from the 60s on start to look more like television sets. And that's because that's when television was at its height. And so they were made to look like televisions with a big banner headline because they wanted to sell newspapers where you'd walk down the street, you see a newsstand, and you would want to be drawn in by the big banner headline. You didn't have to do that in the 18th, and 17th, and 16th centuries, or even in the early 19th centuries, because the people who were wealthy enough and who had the wherewithal to be able to buy newspapers and who had interest in the things that were in newspapers. They would be politicians, they would be people who were entrepreneurs, people who owned sailing ships, people who were interested in the military, things that would be interesting to the world at large. The average guy, as I told you last week, did not read newspapers. They weren't interested in it because they were interested mostly in what happened in their particular area. As I said, the average person up until the 20th century and even into the 20s and 30s never traveled any more than about 7 or 8 miles from their home in their entire lives. So they were interested in what was happening locally, not what was happening across the world. But one of the genres of collecting would be something like this: major successes and achievements. So if you take a look at, of course, one of the major achievements of the 20th century was when Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. And this is a headline from 1962, and it really is the beginning, it marks the beginning of satellite communications. Telstar was the first satellite put up over the Earth to be able to bounce signals off so that you could send TV pictures and other sorts of communication all the way around the world. And even though this was like a pioneer wagon going across the West, now we have airplanes that take us across the country. In the mid-19th century, this is a special edition of a particular newspaper. It's called the Brooklyn Bridge Bulletin. It was one of these one-offs. They put it out when the Brooklyn Bridge was opened in 1883. And it basically is an illustrated newspaper. And in the 1860s to about the 1890s was the era, the golden era of illustrated newspapers. They didn't have the ability to print actual photographs in newspapers till around 1883, 1880, in that era. The newspapers that were the first ones to print photographs were able to do it when they developed a system of little dots. We now call them pixels, but in those days they were dots. They call it halftones. And until the 1870s, 1880s, they didn't have the ability to print an actual photograph in newspapers. So the way that they would illustrate things in newspapers would be by woodcut engravings, and you see a picture of the bridge opening, Brooklyn Bridge opening. And just like some of the early news books, this was a newspaper that was devoted to a one-to-one item, and that was the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. It didn't have sports, it didn't have headlines of military things, it was just that. This is in 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed across the country, the first in the world. And this, where you see a little flag, American flag, and this headline that says United up here, that was a huge banner headline for its time. Somebody asked me before, are you going to show headlines? Well, there weren't headlines back in the 1860s, and even the Civil War didn't have big banner headlines, because the people who were interested in the news at that point were expected to read the entire paper. They didn't have television, they didn't have radio, the magnetic telegraph had just begun, so they didn't have a whole lot of things to do, so this was their method of communication, and they would take and read it, yes.
Didn't they also, in some of the small towns here in America, have people that would go around and read for groups of people that would stand around and listen?
The question was about whether there was somebody who would come in and read the newspaper. They used to do that in coffee houses back in the 18th century. I don't know of anybody in the 19th century that would do that, but there would be clubs where men mostly would gather and they would talk about the news, and they would say, hey, look at this. This is what happened at this particular point in time. And it would be political or military. Going on, this is one of the miracles of the 19th century, and that is the completion of the Erie Canal in New York that actually joined one of the Great Lakes to New York City. And if you notice, this doesn't have a huge banner headline announcing it. It has this little four-word thing that says completion of the Erie Canal. This was a big deal in those days, but this is one genre of collecting, and this would be major successes and achievements. Another genre would be crime and punishment, because people not only like to read about achievements, they like to read about crime and punishment. So these happen to be newspapers or news books having to do with executions along the way. And I showed you last week the Guy Fawkes rebellion in England, in which Guy Fawkes tried to overthrow the Protestant king of England and replace him with a Catholic. And this shows what happened to the conspirators in a illustrated and hand-colored news broadside. These are the conspirators. There's the text of what happened, and these are the execution by chopping their heads off on a scaffold. There's their head on poles. Well, going into the late 18th century, when Louis XVI was overthrown and was executed during the French Revolution, this is a blank back engraving in a British newspaper. It was a Révolution de Paris. And this is an example of a woodcut engraving showing the king's head being held up by the executioner after the guillotine took it off. This is a remarkable technological advance, because the people who were there could actually see what was going on. You didn't have the ability to take and print photographs, but you could actually take and see these woodcut engravings. It might have been 2 or 3 weeks after the event happened, because it took that long to make the engraving. But because of this time lag in news, you have to remember that the news events were shown 2 or 3 weeks, or in the case of an event that happened in Europe, was printed in a newspaper in America, it wouldn't show up for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever amount of time that the sailing ship would take to get over there. We call that the time lag in news. This is Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper, one of the 2 major illustrated newspapers during the Civil War era. One was Frank Leslie's Illustrated, the other was Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly was the more common, but this shows the famous abolitionist John Brown being hanged in Charleston, which was then Virginia, which is now Charleston, West Virginia. And this New York Daily News over here from 1928 is a very interesting newspaper, because it is a photograph of Ruth Snyder, who was a murderess who conspired with her lover, Judd Gray, to kill Ruth Snyder's husband. And she tried to poison him several times. It didn't work. And finally, he came up with a plan that he, her lover, would hide behind a shade in her room, and she would lure her husband over to that shade, and Judd Gray took and hit him with a sash weight. Does everybody know what a sash weight is? Sash weight is a counterweight you use for windows, wooden windows to slide up and down the stick. This would make it easier for you to put it up and down. So it's a counterweight, but it's very heavy. Well, It was not legal to take photographs of people being executed in those days. You actually have pictures of people being hanged in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, legally you couldn't do it. So the New York Daily News was a relatively new newspaper in 1928, and they wanted to get a picture of it, but they were not allowed officially to do it. So the editor of the New York Daily News took a fellow who was going to be a new reporter for the New York Daily News, and he invented a camera that he installed in the toe of his shoe. And he ran a cable release, which is a device that you could use to take the picture. And this fella practiced with this camera for about 2 or 3 months until he got it right. He knew how far away he had to be. He knew he only had one shot. And in those days, when they executed somebody, it wasn't looking through a window. You were actually in the room. And he knew how close he would be to this person. And he actually, when they turned the electricity on and executed her, he had his hand in his pocket. He put his shoe up, clicked the cable release, and this is the picture that he took. It's the only picture in the history of news of somebody being electrocuted while the electricity is on the person.
Wow.
So that's actually a picture of Ruth Snyder.
Did the newspaper get in trouble since they weren't allowed?
Well, he sold a lot of pizzas.
Yeah.
This is actually the second edition, Funerals Held. The first edition had one word on the headline. It said "dead" with an exclamation. Very, very famous. As a matter of fact, that is how I got involved with the museum in Washington. They called me and wanted to know if I had a New York Daily News from I believe it's January 15th, 1928. And I had no idea who they were, and I called them back and I said, I know what you're looking for, who are you? And one thing led to another, and that's how I got involved with them. Interestingly enough, I never was able to get the original newspaper with the photograph of Ruth Snyder and the headline "Dead" in 60 years of looking for it. And about 4 years ago, it popped up on eBay. Nobody knew what it was. It was very, very poorly described, and I was able to buy it. I bid $3,000 on it, and I got it for $19. This brings up another point, and that is that in order to be successful in any collectibles business, one needs to know what it is.
Yes, of course.
You have to know what it is. If I looked at a piece of pottery, or I looked at old, vintage clothing, I had no idea whatsoever as to what it is or why it's worth something. But if you know what it is, it makes a big difference, and you can get things very, very inexpensive. Another genre is warfare. Of course, this has been going on pretty much forever. So here you see a news broadside, illustrated news broadside with a copper plate engraving and text in German at the bottom. It's called a News Zeitung, which means latest news. And this shows the shelling of a city in one of the interminable European wars in the 17th century. This is about 1680. This is the time of the American Revolution. And interestingly enough, this is the report of Tench Tillman, who is famous here locally, who brought the report of the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia, thus, for all practical purposes, ending the Revolutionary War. He was the one who wrote in and announced it to the Congress in Philadelphia. And this is what we would think of back in the 18th century as a headline. Of course, the type has been blown up so you can see it easier, but there is no big banner headline that says Revolutionary War ends, General Washington defeats Cornwallis. There was no headline in those days. During the Mexican War, you're starting to see stacked headlines. That means they are vertical rather than horizontal. But in the era of the Mexican War, you start to see maps. Again, people were not familiar with maps. They weren't familiar with where these battles took place. They hardly knew where Mexico was. And since they didn't go more than 70 miles from their house their entire lives, this gave them some idea as to where the battles took place. You also see maps become prominent and woodcut engravings becoming prominent in newspapers during the Civil War. And this is the fall of Richmond, Virginia on April the 3rd, 1865. Woodcut engraving of a Federal eagle with a shield, map of Richmond, and stacked headlines here in the far left-hand column of the capture of Richmond, Virginia. And when that news came in, it was pretty obvious that it wouldn't be very long until the Civil War had ended. Going on to the Spanish-American War in 1898, you start to see the beginnings of color. This is all going to be black and white for the most part. Here you're starting to see color engravings to appeal to a wider population. You see scenes of the battle. This is a scene of a battle, but this is from the 17th century. Here's a scene of a battle from the late 19th century. And of course, you get to World War II, and you start to see big banner headlines to draw people in who are either driving by or walking by. They get them to buy the paper. Yeah.
So the ones that's in color, they were sold that way?
Yes.
Okay.
They were not hand colored, that's like the one I showed you. These were actually printed in color. As technology improved, you start to be able to actually print newspapers in color. Now the expense goes up when you do that, especially in the beginning when it's a new technology. This, of course, is the invasion of the Gulf of Kuwait during the Iraq War. And again, now you're starting to see not only big banner headlines and maps, you're starting to see maps, you're starting to see color headlines. Again, to draw you in. Another genre is the death of famous outlaws. So I go back to the early 18th century Guy Fawkes plot. You see the death of the conspirators over here. This is a news book from, I believe it was 1720 or so, with the death of Black Bart the pirate. I showed you that last week. This is a newspaper from Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, with the murder of Jesse James. And look at all the stacked headlines. That is the equivalent of a big banner headline in today's paper. But if you were a person who was literate, you could read, and you're interested in the news, you would know that if you saw all of these columns of one column headings, that was a big deal. You would be drawn into it. You would know about that. The significance of this being in the Kansas City paper is that Jesse James' area of operation was Missouri. So you want to be closest to where the event happens. Kansas City is close to where he was killed. And you want to have a newspaper from Missouri, if you can, on the death of Jesse James. And of course, John Dillinger was killed by the FBI in Chicago. And this is the Des Moines Register Extra showing that. But again, this big banner headline is no different to a 20th century individual than this would be to a 19th century individual, or this to a 18th century individual.
If you read all the stacked headlines, would you get a synopsis of the article?
Yes, but they wrote it in very Victorian prose. I think that the Victorian era, from about 1830s to the 1890s, the way they write about things, of course, they didn't have that much visual in those days, so they had to write it in prose that really got you to understand what was going on. Some of the Victorian prose is just unbelievable. It's like reading Shakespeare in some ways. They can say it in a way that you don't actually say it, but you get the idea. And again, this over here is a news book from 1588 with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in German, and a woodcut engraving, which is a stock engraving here of ships. It really isn't what the Armada looked like, but it gives you an idea. And here you've got basically the same thing in a paper from 300 years later, from 1898, of the Battle of Manila Bay, which was the first major naval battle of the Spanish-American War, but now it's in color. Now you have woodcut engravings, you have patriotic symbols there, you have a big headline, and then the accounts of it are on the inside page. But basically, this is the same thing, just 3 centuries apart.
The color, remember when I was a kid, the only color was the comics in the newspaper.
Yes,
So
but the
And only on
color,
Sunday.
the ability to print photographs in color came in the 1960s.
Yeah.
This was a process that was quite difficult to do and quite expensive, so you had to charge more for it. So usually the papers that you see that have color in it in the 19th and early 20th century are going to be papers from big cities, New York City, Chicago, that sort of thing. They have the money, they have the ability to sell huge numbers of paper, so they can afford to buy the equipment and they can afford to sell it. The first report of one of the, arguably, was the most important event in world history, was the discovery of America by Columbus. Took him a couple of months to get over from Portugal or Spain, wherever he left from. He couldn't get it over by radio or television, so they had to wait till he got back. And he didn't have reporters that met him at the dock and said, well, Columbus, did you discover America? He came back and he wrote a letter. And this is the Columbus letter right here. It has a picture of a ship, a stock picture. Christopher Columbus. And this is a translation of what the Italian looks like over here. This is a news book. And it's extremely, extremely rare. I have looked for this for 60 years. One came up for sale about a year ago over in Europe. It came out of it. There have been some that have come up for auction, but they were always news books with the Columbus letter from 1492 that were stolen from libraries in Europe. And when it came up for auction, the librarians would know about it, and they were able to pull it out of the auction. This one came out of an estate in Europe about a year ago. Does anyone want to hazard a guess at what this brought at auction?
More than $17.
$12 million. But I'll tell you something rather interesting.
Did you buy it?
No. I'll tell you something that's very interesting, though. Remember, most of the men here, remember when we were kids and we used to buy bubblegum cars like Mickey Mantle, 1952 or thereabouts? And we put them on the spokes of our wheels with a laundry clip so that it would make a sound like a motorbike. A 1952 Mickey Mantle in tip-top shape, the best one known, but it's a baseball card, 1952, sold about the same time as this for $10.5 million.
Wow.
So it really is unbelievable what has happened lately. I mean, it really is.
Are auction prices inflated?
No, that's what it brings.
So you could turn around the next day and probably sell it for the same amount or more?
No, I mean, that's not the way it works. You usually have to hold on. It's the greater fool theory. You have to hold it on until the greater fool comes along and will pay you more money for it. But I mean, I'll give you an example. About 20 years ago, the museum asked me to. There was a newspaper that came up for auction. It was the Pennsylvania Packet and Daily Advertiser from September the 19th, 1787. It was the first printing of the Constitution in a newspaper. Front page printing, just beautifully done. And they contracted me to buy it for them at an auction. And they authorized me to go to $200,000 on it. I had an opportunity to buy that paper 45 or 50 years ago at a paper show for $20,000 and turned it down because I thought it was ridiculous. It's too expensive. I've been on the auction by phone for the museum. And I thought I told them there's no way in the world that you're not going to get it. I mean, there's just no way. I wasn't even the underbidder. it went for $450,000, and I wasn't even in second place. I actually went a little bit over. I went to 225 because I knew they would pay it. And it sold for $450,000. It's just unbelievable. So it all depends on time. When the stock market went way, 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 way up, a lot of people didn't have problems. They had all the money you want, but what they wanted were things they could hang on the wall that were iconic. They wanted a 1952 Mickey Mantle baseball card or a Star Wars #1 comic book. I said that for one of the fellows out there in the audience who has one for sale tonight. Salem witch trials was a very, very famous episode in American history, and yet there was no newspaper in those days to print anything about it. Britain, of course, was the colonizer, and we were the colonies of Great Britain, so they thought of us as part of Great Britain. So the only news about the Salem witch trials that they had here in the States was an advertisement, you see right here, for a book called By Cotton Mather, in which he printed it in Boston, and then whenever it was reprinted in London, and it was in a newspaper called the Athenian Mercury. There are no other newspapers, either in Britain or in America, that have the Salem witch trials. However, there was something called a news book at that time. It was a book that was printed with the text and with the following of the trial, long, very, very long and detailed contemporary account of the Salem witch trials. It was called The Wonders of the Invisible World, the Trials of Several Witches in New England. This is the London edition by Cotton Mather. There's also a Boston edition. And remember, you want to have the edition that's the first edition, and you want to have the one that's printed closest to where the event happened. So you want the one that was printed in Boston. The one in Boston probably would sell for like $100,000. The one that was printed and reprinted in London might be $35,000. So there's a difference. So that's what I call knowing what it is. There were no banner headlines for the most part in colonial days, but this is the Maryland Gazette, and it has a headline. This is the first banner headline in a newspaper, period. And this is the treaty that ended the French and Indian War in 1763. There was actually two treaties. One was the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and then there was a secret treaty that came along after that. This was the first announcement that the French and Indian War, which was called King
Phillips.
What's that?
King Phillips.
No, it wasn't King Philip. I want to say King George.
George the Third?
It was George III, but that wasn't what it was called. It was called, well, anyway, I can't think of what the name of it is. But anyway, this is the first banner headline you'll see in an American newspaper. And it's in the Maryland Gazette, printed in Annapolis, Maryland.
Did they write these things with sort of the principles of journalism? You sort of summarize at the top, give more information? So
The answer is sometimes yes. When you see the stacked headlines, yes, they do.
Yeah.
The first paragraph will tell you. You talked about, did they describe it? During the Victorian times, if someone was hanged, the headline would be launched into eternity. Something like that. I mean, it was just, their verbiage was absolutely wonderful. Again, this is the Boston Massacre, one of the most important events of the American Revolution. And what you see here, if you were here last week, are turn rules, black mourning rules, to show something bad happened. This was not because of the death of the people. This was because it was an event that they knew was important, that they wanted people to have their attention drawn to it. Boston Tea Party, again, no big banner headline, just text. Because the people who were interested in these newspapers and who read them are going to read the entire newspaper. And again, these newspapers were weekly, and they were only 4 pages, 2 leaves. This is the Boston Gazette when our own Tench Tillman announced the defeat of the British General Cornwallis. And again, this is on the front page here. And this shows, this is the text of, they always, whenever they were talking about a battle, and if their side won, they always write, I have the honor to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis was happily effected. I mean, they really got their words were really terrific. They really knew how to write in those days, and they didn't have GPT to do it, you know. It's unbelievable. I left off with this actually last time, and this is the early front page printing of the Declaration of Independence. And you can see right up here is the first news of it. Notice that this is a paper printed in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's dated July the 16th. Well, the Declaration of Independence was signed on July the 2nd. And the first printing of the Declaration of Independence in a newspaper was in a daily paper called the Pennsylvania Evening Post. It was printed on July the 6th on an inside page. It's a very valuable paper. But the first notice that America had declared itself independent was in the Pennsylvania Evening Post of July the 4th, and it was on page 4 of a 4-page paper. And interestingly enough, there's 2 versions of it. This is what I mean when you need to know what it is. They had printed up the paper on July the 4th, and all the news was there. It was printed by hand. They couldn't change it easily. And the news came in that America had declared itself independent. So they pulled an ad from the back page and they put in one line that said, today the Congress has declared the United States free and independent states. That's a very valuable paper. So even though it's not the printing of the Declaration, it is the first notice in any newspaper. And notice that the July the 4th and July 6th issues were printed in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. Well, if you notice here, this is a paper from Salem, Massachusetts, and it was printed on July the 16th. You say, well, that's like 2 weeks afterwards. Well, that is, again, the time lag of news. The news would only travel as fast as a person could walk, or a horse could ride, or a ship could sail. And here you go, a declaration by representatives of the United States of America. Again, this is a very, very rare paper. Nice front page printing. Once the Constitution had been written, it was sent to the states for ratification. And anyone who has seen the show Hamilton will know that he was very involved in this. He and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers in support of it. And this was not a sure thing. They did not know that the Constitution would actually be ratified. There's some doubt that it would not be ratified. So the editor of the Massachusetts Sentinel came up with a very, very ingenious way of showing people, especially people who couldn't read, the progress of the Constitution being ratified. And he did it with what's called the pillar cartoons. And that is, they describe the Constitution as the pillar of the country, as the edifice of the country, and it would be put up pillar by pillar, each pillar being a state ratifying the Constitution. So here you've got 6 pillars up there, and a hand of God helping to put the pillars up. Here you've got 7 pillars up, and then 1 just about ready to go. Here you've got the hand of God helping to push the pillars up. So you can see what he's doing. He's giving you a visualization of the ratification of the Constitution as it went along. And this is the last one in the series, showing the last 2 pillars being put up. Just a very, very interesting way of doing it. But again, this was not something that was very common at the time. It was very unusual and very scarce. Does anybody know what the most disastrous defeat of the American Army by the Native American Indians in history was?
The Colombian Trenches.
Well, the answer that most people would say
Before this, I would have thought.
Custer's defeat and Little Bighorn. It wasn't. It was the defeat of General St. Clair by the Native American Indians at Fort Jefferson. This is a
I grew up.
illustrated news broadside, a one-off, bloody Indian battle showing the coffins of some of the people who were killed. This is the general. It's got the little death's head over here. And they've got text over here talking about the actual battle itself. And remember we talked about last week how it was easy for people to remember things if you put them in rhymes. Just like remembering songs from when you grew up. We all remember, some of the songs from when we were kids. This is how people could remember it. Somebody read it to them or family members read it, they could remember the rhyme. When George Washington died on December the 14th, 1779, this was big news. And again, there was a lot of time lag in news, but when the news came in, it was the first report of it. All they knew is that he had died. They didn't have a full report that would come later. This is how they displayed it. Real thick black mourning borders. Alexandria, Virginia was the closest to Mount Vernon where he died. And this talks about the death of General George Washington. This is a huge banner headline for its time. And someone who lived in the late 18th century would know that somebody important had died when you saw the black mourning balls like that.
They called him General Washington, not President Washington.
Well, even when he was president, he was called General Washington. And anybody who has seen Hamilton, you can see Thomas's Massachusetts Spy with turned rules, thick mourning orders, big headline, fatal duel with the death of Alexander Hamilton, in a duel with Harry Burke. For extra credit, does anybody know where that duel took place?
Yeah, Jersey, it was in New Jersey.
That's correct. Can you be more specific?
Was it Hoboken?
Weehawken Heights.
We
New
don't,
Jersey.
right across the river.
I'll tell you a funny story because I was out skiing in Park City, Utah about 10 years ago. And my friend, who's actually on the screen right now, he's laughing and waving, Stanley. We were out there eating dinner one night. We were talking about history of newspapers. And the person at the table next to us was talking about it, and he answered some of the questions we had. So we were talking back and forth. Turns out he was a retired police officer from New York City. He used to ride a horse downtown Manhattan. And we got along really terrifically that night. And I sent him a present having to do with something, an event that he was interested in from my newspaper collection. And he sent all of us, the three of us who were out there skiing, T-shirts having to do with, T-shirts and hats having to do with this mounted cavalry of the police department in New York. It's kind of a funny thing. What was the worst earthquake in American history? The most powerful earthquake in American history. What do you think?
Everybody says.
It wasn't the San Francisco earthquake. That was the one that most people know about. The most powerful earthquake in American history was the earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri in 1811. It was the earthquake that formed Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, and the Mississippi River actually flowed backwards when this earthquake happened. The reason why we don't remember it as much is because there weren't very many people out there at the time. So they didn't have a lot of casualties that we knew about. But the earthquake took place in Missouri was actually felt all the way far east as Charleston, South Carolina, New York City, Boston,
I believe.
believe it or not.
How big is the shape was it? They didn't even know how to measure it.
This is a banner headline with the end of the War of 1812, and now you're starting to see larger type, bigger headlines, fancier engravings. The invention of photography is something that I call news that whispers. It's a little report here about the fact that Daguerre, who was the fellow who invented, he was actually not the person who invented it, but he was the guy who got credit for it. The French Academy of Sciences was given a gift of the patent for photography by Daguerre. And this is a report from the French Academy of Science in 1839 with the description of the invention of photography. Just before this, the only way you could get an image in any form would be by drawing it with a camera obscura, where you could actually project an image with using a sun and a small pinhole, but you had no way of making it permanent. Daguerre's contribution was being able to make it permanent. In the 1840s, this is what I call the golden era of woodcut engraving. Now you're starting to see engravings because papers wanted to attract buyers. You now had the ability to print papers in large quantities. You didn't have a hand press where you were printing them one at a time, both sides. You now had the press that enabled you to print these in large quantities, and the penny press was a result of this. So you could sell a lot more newspapers, and you could sell them for a lot less money, and that's exactly what they started to do. So they had to have ways to be able to draw people in to buy these papers, and one of the ways to do it was to have them have engravings that people could take and would draw them into it. So this is actually the election of William Henry Harrison, one of our most forgettable presidents, mainly because he only served 1 month in office. He was elected, he was inaugurated in March, and he died in April. He gave the longest inaugural speech in history. He was out there in the rain, reading this speech for like hours, and he caught a cold and he died. There's a moral to that somewhere.
Yeah.
Once again, news that whispers. This is the invention of the electromagnetic telegraph by Samuel Morse. They didn't really know what that really meant at the time, but it's news that whispers. Very small, very understated. This is the election of James Polk in 1844, and again, you can see they have a stock engraving of this eagle on a shield, and they would just take and fill in the blank spots here with whatever names that they would. I've got newspapers from different eras that have the same engraving, just have different names in it. So they didn't have to redo it over and over again. Mexican War ends, and the newspaper that was closest to the Mexican War was in New Orleans, Daily Delta, and now you see Post writer coming in with news over here. This is one of my favorite papers. Never been able to find this. I've never seen it up for auction. If it ever came up for auction, it would bring 6 figures. It's that much of a newspaper. This is the Californian from San Francisco. It's dated March the 15th, 1848. This is the first announcement in the country of the discovery of gold in California. The news didn't get to the East Coast until August the 19th, 1848. So this is March. So 5 months later, ships had to go around the Horn of Africa, or they had to go across the Panama Canal. Or Panama, there was no canal there at the time. But anyway, this to me is one of the neatest papers that I've never been able to find. And I call this news that whispers. They started the Pony Express, again, news that whispered. You know, when we think about the Pony Express, we think from the cowboy movies, it was around for like 10, 20, 30 years. Anybody want to guess how long the Pony Express lasted?
18
It
months.
was 18 months. Yeah, but it was very romantic. I mean, they would only take orphans to ride across the country and these from station to station on the Pony Express because it was so dangerous. They'd be killed by Indians or they'd fall into a creek or something. But it only lasted for 18 months. And do you have any idea why the Pony Express eventually ended? No, because of electromagnetic telegraph. You didn't need people riding across the country.
What were the odds of the letter actually making it across?
Very, very low.
Yeah.
They were young people for obvious reasons. And you could only ride for like 6, 7, I think it was like 2 or 3 hours. And then you got to another station, somebody else took over. One of the most valuable stamps in American philately is the stamps that were carried in the first or second Pony Express there. They're very, very, very valuable. Again, following up on the woodcut engravings for military thing, for electoral things, this is when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Doesn't have his name though, it just says a Republican president of the US. And you see they filled in these little spaces here with the names. When the Civil War came along, the South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, and they had a convention that lasted about 2 weeks. And on the night of December the 20th, 1860, they printed up the Charleston Mercenary Extra in Charleston, South Carolina, the ordinance to dissolve contract between South Carolina and the United States of America. The Union is dissolved. This is a broadside printed on one side only, about this big by about that big. This is the first newspaper to announce the secession of South Carolina, and it's also the first Confederate imprint. This is a broadside from Charleston where the event happened, with the beginning of the Civil War, with the Battle of Fort Sumter. Again, banner headline. It's not that big. It's blank on the back, but it's only about 10 inches by about 6 inches across. But this at the time would have been a huge, huge banner headline. Very, very valuable. Gettysburg Address. Again, at the time when it happened, nobody knew that this was going to be such a famous thing. Usually it's on an inside page, usually page 2 or 3. I found this at an auction about 15 years ago in a nondescript paper, Pennsylvania, and it's on the front page, 7 years ago, right here. It's on the front page right here. When the war's end came, usually the newspapers that printed it, printed the surrender of Lee to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The earliest newspaper I have ever seen was on April the 10th. The correspondence between Grant and Lee and the surrender of Lee to Grant is usually in the newspapers from April the 10th. This is the only newspaper broadside I've ever seen printed on April the 9th. And it's a little broad slip extra. It's very small. It's about 6 inches by 4 inches, and it was printed on a single piece of paper. This was not put up on the wall. This was just passed around with people in the town. This is very interesting. During the Civil War, the South had a problem. The North had cut them off by blockading the southern ports. They wanted to starve them into submission. So when the South ports were blockaded, they could bring in food, they could bring in ordnance and things to make military supplies. But they were cut off, the South was cut off from newsprint, which came from the northern paper mills, Canada, New England, and what have you. So after the South ran out of its paper stock, we're normally talking about southern Confederate states were on the Gulf, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, in that area. They had no paper to print it on. So what they did was they took wallpaper samples from stores where people would go in to pick the wallpaper up, and they would print it on the blank back of the wallpaper. Here's the wallpaper, and this is the news right here. Opelousas Courier.
Yeah, it's very effective.
These are all samples of wallpapers. So it wasn't on one type of wallpaper. These were all samples that the people could take home with them and say, oh, put it on the wall, let's see if it looks good. So these are very, very famous wallpaper newspapers during the Civil War. This is one of the main things that I collect. I like papers printed on newspapers printed on unusual materials. So the most famous wallpaper newspaper was the Vicksburg Daily Citizen. Vicksburg was under siege by the Union for a number of months. They were starving them into submission. They couldn't get food in, and Vicksburg actually fell on July the 4th. It was taken over by the Union troops. But Vicksburg had printed a newspaper on July the 2nd, and that's this one right here. And it was printed on newspaper, on a wallpaper. And when the Northern troops came in, they pulled the type from right here. There was an ad there, and they pulled the type and they put down the fact that they were there and they just taken over the city. So that's why this is a newspaper that was printed on July the 2nd, but the note is dated July the 4th. Vicksburg did not celebrate the 4th of July for 100 years after this because it represented the day that Vicksburg felt.
So to 1963?
Yes.
Whoa. That's really.
Not only did they print on wallpaper,
I didn't know the graphs.
not only did they print on wallpaper, but they printed on whatever they had. And this is called necessity paper. This is thick cigar paper. It's the paper they used to make cigars out of. And they printed it on this. In Idaho, because of a shortage of paper, they printed on bright yellow paper. This is a paper printed in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Again, this is on dark brown necessity paper. Some people see this in my collection and they think that it is faded over the years. It hasn't. This is what it looks like.
So what is
Oh,
necessity
yeah, Mr.
paper?
Tracy asked.
What's that?
It was from the tobacco. Necessity. Cigar.
No, this is not cigar paper.
No.
This is just dark brown paper.
Oh, just-
The other one was on cigar paper.
Why is it called necessity?
Is that what they read?
Because it's a paper that the newspaper printed on out of necessity. They didn't have regular newsprint. So here it just says, being unable to have newspaper from the north, we are compelled to use brown paper as a substitute. And oftentimes, when they printed on necessity paper, whatever that necessity paper was, they would sometimes say in the paper that they were cut off from the paper and this is what they had to print on.
Would that paper last longer?
That paper looks like the day it came off the press. Here's a paper printed in Texas, again, a Confederate city, printed on bright green necessity paper. This is a paper in Austin, Texas, that's printed on tissue paper. It's so thin, if you hold it up and put your hand behind it, you can see your hand through it. Now, you asked if it lasts long, you can see it's starting to deteriorate up here.
I'm surprised that it's
Yeah.
Starting to deteriorate up here. But again, just think about it, about how these things have lasted over the years. And they're available, if you know what to look for. So again, what I mean when I say you got to know what it is.
Steve,
Yeah,
did they ask people to donate that they needed paper printing?
they did it first. They did it first. But again, they just ran out of paper. They had no paper from the north. They couldn't get it in because of the northern blockade. So the thing that they would just print on whatever they had to print it on. I'm going to show you other things like that now too. It wasn't just the Civil War and the fact that the South was cut off from the northern paper mills. You had some similar things happen in Dakota Territory. They had a terrible, terrible blizzard in 1881 in Dakota Territory, and they had to print it on necessity paper because of that. Not only did they print it on necessity paper because of the blizzard, this is a blizzard in Minnesota in 1881 when they also printed on the back of wallpaper, just like they did during the Civil War. It's ingenious if you think about
Yeah,
it.
it is. They really wanted to be.
In that same blizzard in Dakota Territory, Sioux Valley, Dakota Territory, it was printed on cloth, necessity paper. So somebody might have had some cloth to make clothes of. They actually called for things that they could print on, any surface that they could use, and they printed on these, on cloth.
What's interesting is that that papers were considered that important.
They were very important, yeah.
Right? Everything depended
No
on.
TV, no radio, no telegraph. Well, they had telegraphs, but not up there. They actually printed not only on cloth, they printed on grain sacks. just think you're here in Dakota Territory, you're on a farm. What do you got lots of? You got a lot of grain sacks. You use those to feed the animals. You got a pile of sacks. Newspaper guy comes by. What do you got to print on? A sack. So that's what this is. It's printed on a grain sack, and you can see the little threads over here.
It printed so clearly.
I know.
In 1865, the first newspaper to show engraved pictures of Abraham Lincoln assassination was Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie on April the 29th. But there was one paper that had it a week earlier, and that's the National Police Gazette. Think National Enquirer. When you go to the food store, it talks about all these scandals and what have you. That's what the National Police Gazette was in 1865. So 1 week after the event happened, after Lincoln was assassinated on the night of the 14th, they had somebody carve and engrave all these woodcut engravings. And this actually is the first illustration of the assassination of Lincoln, and these sold like hotcakes in New York City. Okay, could you go to 246? Everybody is familiar with the term gerrymander. It's really not pronounced gerrymander. The term is gerrymander, but that's what everybody calls it. But it's actually gerrymander. And the gerrymander started in 1812 in the gubernatorial election in Boston, when one of the people who was running for governor was Elbridge Gerry, and his political party managed to change the districts of Massachusetts for his own political benefit. And he had a chart up on the wall and political office. And the editor of the Boston Gazette, not the Boston paper, the Boston Gazette, came by and looked at it, and he said, and Jerry said, that looks like a salamander. And the editor said, no, he said, it looks like a gerrymander, meaning gerrymander Gary. So he took and he drew wings on it, a head, and claws, and that is where the term gerrymander came from, 1812, 200 some odd years ago. This is very, very scarce, very hard to find. This is not the first, but it was done about a week later. Boston Gazette had the first one, but this is very, very early. Original gerrymander cartoon. Did you go to 282? January of 1840, there was a very advanced steamship called the Steamboat Lexington. And Steamboat Lexington, for its time, was the Titanic of its day. Very, very advanced, could hold a lot of people, and it plied the waters of Long Island Sound between Long Island and Connecticut. And on the night of January 13th, it went out. It had about 400, I believe it was, 220 people. And it was the coldest day they'd ever experienced in Long Island Sound. It was actually ice floes floating in Long Island Sound. It was so cold, very windy. And they went out, and this ship had bales of cotton all along the outside of it to keep the cold and the wind from getting into the people. It was overloaded, and of course it was a steamboat, had a boiler. And when they were out on the Long Island Sound with about 200 and some odd passengers, sparks from the smokestack ignited some of those bales of cotton that were around the periphery. The boat caught on fire. So most of the people were in the front, and as that fire would come back, they couldn't put the fire out. The fire buckets were not accessible. The fire worked its way from the front of the boat all the way to the back. And people, of course, kept moving, and the boat tipped over. And it sank. Out of the 200 and some odd people that were on that boat, You want to guess how many people survived that?
3.
Three.
Right.
One was
Totally guessed.
one was a person, there was a captain of another boat who was on it, there was another passenger, and there was an actual crewman on the boat. And they survived by getting on the cotton bale and actually floating away. If you went into the water, when the water was frozen, you didn't last for 5 minutes, you died. And they're out in the middle.
That's where this expression bailing out came
No. Don't listen. Don't listen to him. He knows a lot about marathons, but he knows nothing about it.
That's good to me.
Yeah, I would use that.
The interesting thing about this is that when it happened, they wanted to sell newspapers. And so Charles Dana was the editor of the New York Sun. He had a friend. The friend was Nathaniel Courier. And he and Courier got together and they said, you know, if I take and I make a picture of what happened, and you make the text down the bottom, and we sell it, it'll sell a lot. And Nathaniel Courier had the idea to do that, and that's exactly what they did. The first engraving was black and white, and they had text at the bottom. Then Courier had the idea that he could take these things, he actually made the pictures, had a blank space at the bottom, gave them to the publisher of the New York Sun, who added the text at the bottom, printed it. And Courier had a group of women in the town where he was that would sit around the table. Each of them had a different color pencil. And each of them would color one color on this and then pass it on to the next woman. So every one of these is different to some extent. But they were all done by women at the time, and they sold tons of these things. Tons of them. I mean, it was the first instant color breaking news format. And this is what brought Nathaniel Courier and later his partner Ives to prominence in portraits during the 19th century. That's what it did. You can see the people. This is actually not what it looked like. This is not what it looked like. But to somebody in the mid or the early 19th century, this is about as close to a breaking news on television as you would ever going to see. Everybody knows about Dewey defeats Truman, but this has the announcement that the 1840 election was won by Martin Van Buren.
No.
Right up here. Van Buren president. So this is basically Dewey defeats Truman 108 years earlier. Because it was actually William Henry Harrison who was elected. I'll go on to 295. Now you're starting to see we're moving from text to engravings. And that's how you got people, you drew them in. This is the first full front page engraving of an event that happened. This is the funeral of President Andrew Jackson in 1845. Before this, you didn't have papers with a full front page of engravings. This is about 3 weeks after he died. Just imagine how much work it took to do this. Remember, in order to do this, you have to carve in a block of wood backwards, looking in a mirror. And that's what you use to print these things. Just an amazing technology for its time. Um, 367. This is a little broad slip extra with a caption of Richmond, Virginia. It's about 2 or 3 inches by 2 inches, very, very small. It's a little slip of paper. When the news came in, they would take it, they would announce it. But I thought the most interesting thing about this is this little contemporary note down at the bottom. The capture of Richmond, Herald Office, April 3rd. Of course, if you were alive at the time, you knew it was 1865.
They didn't print the year.
Well, you knew this. It was breaking news. They didn't bother to print the year. But someone down at the bottom in brown iron gall ink wrote, then there will soon be an end to this awful war. I just thought it was interesting that here you got somebody speaking to you 150 years ago. It's almost like he was right there. You can just imagine from a human standpoint that, he's right there with you.
And he's the one that added the date.
He added the date, and he also put down the contemporary note in brown iron gold ink.
And he told that to you always.
390. In the 1870s, to some extent, like we have today, there's a lot of political controversy. Have any of you heard of Boss William Tweed? Tammany? Yeah, Tweed ran.
Tammany Hall.
Tweed was like a former president of ours who won't name, who was an incredible con man. He knew how to take. He was a thief because he was the mayor of New York City, and he would let these contracts for millions of dollars, and he would take like $900,000 of it and put it in his pocket, and he'd spend $100,000 on this stuff. And the famous artist Thomas Nast knew that that the people were not getting the message. So he made this cartoon, which is very, 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 very famous for Harper's Weekly. There's Boss Tweed. And it shows the Tammany Tiger. This was a symbol of the Tammany Ring in New York. And it shows the city of New York. And there's Boss Tweed up here. And down here, the headline or the Times says, the headline says, the Tammany Tiger loose. What are you going to do about it? And William Marcy Tweed, who was the thief, said, I don't care about what they print about me. He said, because my constituents can't read, but they sure know how to look at the pictures. And he was actually ousted from office and put in jail because of that. Very, very famous political cartoon. This is, if you go back to Join or Die cartoon, Unite or Die, Gerrymander, the Edifice cartoons, this is all a continuation of it. But this didn't pop up all of a sudden out of thin air. The others have to come first. Would you go to 411? One of the most famous events in Wild West history, I'll say the most famous event in Wild West history, is the gunfight at the OK Corral. They made a movie of it, Tombstone, they have a show about it. And one of the most difficult newspapers to get as a collector is a paper from Tombstone with coverage of the gunfight at the OK Corral. The day after it happened on October 26, 1881. The October 27th issue of the Tombstone Epitaph, I've only seen one of them in my life. And I tried to buy it from somebody 50 years ago, and I called him every 5 years, and he would keep raising the price every time. And not just by a little, by a lot. So I never actually had an opportunity to get it. But what this is the inquest in Tombstone, where they had eyewitnesses to the gunfight at the OK Corral tell what happened. And I just thought it was very interesting because in this, you see, talks about the Clantons and McCarrys. He said one of them say, I think it was Wyatt Earp, and it says, you S of a B, you have been looking for a fight, and now you can have it. They wouldn't print the actual words, but people knew what it was. So this is the testimony of John Behan, who was the sheriff of Tombstone. So this is his eyewitness account of what happened. So other than having the actual next day description in the newspaper, in the Tombstone newspaper, this is about as close as you can get. And it talks about Morgan Earp, it talks about Doc Holliday, it talks about Virgil Earp, Wyatt Earp. Very, very exciting to see it. It describes it in very, very very, very detailed. The nickel-plated pistol was first fired. It's just really, really interesting to read it.
Jesse James got a headline.
Okay, well, I'll show you that. Yeah, I'll show you that. This is the Neosho Times newspaper. This is from Neosho, Missouri, in 1882. It's a weekly newspaper. Jesse James had been shot on April the 3rd, 1882. I bought this paper because of this, of course. But this is not actually a headline. This is an ad for a clothing store that is used to draw your attention to the ad. And what they put there was Jesse James assassinated. Everybody in the ocean at this point, April 20th, knew he'd been killed. But this was a way that the advertisers would pull you in to be able to look at the ad for clothing. As a matter of fact, this is not unusual. You see this a lot in newspapers through the ages, when, especially during the Civil War, if there's a big battle, or the Mexican or the Spanish-American War era. It'll say big battle, and then right underneath it, it'll be a clothing ad. 426.
They still do that.
Elizabeth Gordon took an axe, gave her father 40 whacks, and when the job was nicely done, she gave her mother 41. This is the Boston paper with the murder of Lizzie Borden's parents. She was actually tried and found not guilty.
I know.
She was like the O.J. Simpson trial of the 1800s.
Why was
And
she
of course,
not guilty?
it's very interesting why.
Yeah.
Because I looked into that. They didn't believe, her father was a very, very wealthy guy. And her stepmother was actually her stepmother. First, her mother died, and this was Andrew Gordon's second wife. And Lizzie, she didn't get along. The trial was held in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is close to Boston. In those days, in the Victorian era, they didn't believe that a wealthy woman would kill somebody like that. They just couldn't conceive of it. And they made do of that. And basically speaking, that's why they had it. It was just like the O.J. Simpson trial. They had an axe with the blood on it. They still didn't believe that she did.
She could have shot somebody on Fifth Avenue.
She could have shot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not be convicted. You got that right. This is the Illustrated Police News, and this is just like the National Enquirer. They would take the masthead, they overcut it with a headline, word murders, and on the inside you see engravings of various things. The Illustrated Police News, or the Illustrated, the Illustrated Police News was basically 16 pages, it was 8 pages of woodcut engravings and 8 pages of text. And it covered, they were very smart. They really were very smart. They knew what their audience wanted. What did they want? They wanted mayhem, crime, sex, and scandals. National Enquirer. And they sold a lot of copies of it. Just like today. As I said in the last presentation, people's curiosity doesn't change. The same thing that was of interest 200 or 300 years ago, 400 years ago, the same thing is of interest now.
7 deadly sins.
Maybe not aliens.
Well, actually, there are people who collect reports of what they think are flying saucers or extraterrestrials from the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, before the big flying saucer craze in July of 1947. You can see things that are in a newspaper that say a strange object was seen in the sky going at high speed. And so it was around then. They just didn't call them flying saucers. They had no name for it. In the 1890s, you can see this is the start of when you start to see almost always in big city papers, you had symbols and engravings. And this is what people look for. In 1892, the symbol of the Democratic Party, Grover Cleveland, was a rooster. It wasn't a doggy. And again, when a person in the 1890s saw this, they would know that Grover Cleveland was elected president. illustrated newspaper with the Lizzie Borden trial. This is a very interesting paper. The Indianapolis Freeman is not the first African-American newspaper. But the Indianapolis Freeman, printed in Indianapolis, Indiana, was the first nationally distributed illustrated newspaper for an African-American audience. So it was nationally distributed. I was lucky enough to buy about 14 or 15 bound volumes of this about 25 years ago. And it's an absolutely wonderful paper because it covers the Black community in ways that the mainstream press did not. And so you were very, very hard pressed to find a paper that would have a full cut engraving of Frederick Douglass on their front page like this. And they used this woodcut engraving over and over again. This is when he was still living. He died in 1894. But I thought this was great. The headline here is "The One Great Negro." That was nice, interesting. Now, the Boston Post, Boston was a hotbed of anti-slavery, So when Frederick Douglass died, the Boston Post actually had a portrait of him, a woodcut engraving portrait of him on the front page. But this is the only one I've ever seen in all my years of collecting with his picture on the front page. It's usually on an inside page with a very small article.
What's the John Hancock?
What's that?
The life insurance company.
Is it a company?
Yeah, it says Mutual Life Insurance.
Yeah, John
Company.
Hancock is.
It was.
And anybody who's lived in or been in Boston,
Yeah.
the biggest building in Boston was John Hancock's. Yeah, that's their headquarters. I love this one too. One of the Wild West outlaw who supposedly killed the most people was John Wesley Hardin. And when he died in a saloon in 1895, I thought that the headline on this heading was great. He bit the dust quick. I mean, don't the Victorian era people. What can we do? John Wesley Hardin shot to death in El Paso. He became desperate and is slain by City Marshal Soman, a noted desperado gone. This is rather interesting in that this is the Indianapolis Freeman, the African-American newspaper. They had wonderful political cartoons in it that were devoted to the African-American community, not only in Indianapolis, but all the way throughout the country. And some of these are cartoons you would not see in a mainstream newspaper. And this is one of them. This has to do with the Plessy versus Ferguson case. It said that separate but equal is okay. So what you see are engravings here of an African-American man going by a window that said whites only. And over here you see an African-American woman and a white woman sitting together in a train car, a trolley, where the white woman is turned away from her, has her back to her. Down here, it's pretty obvious. Right here you see this Caucasian fellow having the door opened by this black guy, and he's just annoying him. So basically, it shows some of the injustices done as illustrated by the separate but equal Jim Crow laws in the South. You would not see this in a mainstream newspaper these days. This is what you would see in a mainstream newspaper in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which was overturned in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. And this is just a small article, separate cars for Negroes. That's it. That is the report of the Supreme Court decision. I had a customer who was a lawyer, forget exactly where he was, but he wanted me to find him papers with famous Supreme Court cases, all the way from Marbury versus Madison, all the way throughout history. What have you? Taney decision in 1857, and he sent me a list, and I had all a list of the papers he wanted, the dates and the decisions. And I found him about 18 or so of them. And he had a list of 25. And I had it on my wall. And one day I was going through a volume and I came across one of the papers that he wanted. And I've been selling to him for 5, 10 years or so. So I called him up and I asked the secretary, I said, "Is Mr. So-and-so there?" He said, "Oh, he died." I said, "You know, it's interesting because he hadn't bought anything for me. Here now, whatever happened to him, he died." So the next question was, what did he do with the papers? You always have to ask that question. It's interesting because I've been in this, you know, being in dentistry for many years and also having this as a hobby. I've been selling to people and trading with people for over the past 60 years. I now get calls from wives and children of the people I sold to 40, 50 years ago, saying that they have the collection. They know that I sold it because my bills, my invoices were in the collection. Some people keep them, but I like to buy the collection back. So I get to sell it once or twice for $3. The explosion of the warship USS Maine in Havana Harbor was the match that led off the Spanish-American War, although it probably was not the Spanish that blew up the warship. That really didn't matter. McKinley wanted to go to war, and this was just an excuse to do it. The Saturday Globe was an interesting paper because it was printed in color engravings on the front page every single week. And that is the outstanding technical improvement that they had. They had really, really wonderful front page engravings. Now you're starting to see big headlines. Those of you who want big headlines started in the 1890s. And that's because the New York City, which is where most of these were printed, moved from riding around on horses and buggies to cars. So you had to attract somebody's attention who was driving by in a car. So you had to make big headlines that could be seen by somebody who didn't have the best set of eyes walking by, so he could come over to your stand and buy the paper. And that's why you start to see big banner headlines in the 1890s. They also started to have color like this, the Illustrated War News. This was a monthly paper, but they had just gorgeous, these are just really gorgeous. This was the era of what's called chromolithography, which was a coloring process that was invented in Germany in the 1860s, I believe. And some of the newspapers from this time are just absolutely gorgeous. They're like, they're like televisions, like high definition television at the time.
How long did the color last? I mean, as far as in years is concerned.
This is over 125 years old, still there.
I mean, how long did newspapers continue to?
Well, the thing that stopped the color was the fact that it became too expensive.
Yeah, because I remember when USA Today came out, it was in color, and it was a big deal.
Yes, but in those days, when USA Today came out, some of the color newspapers came out, the process had been cheapened. You could print things up. If you look at newspapers from the 1960s in color, color's awful. It's like watching television from the 1950s in a color TV. The color's awful. It's very pastel looking. It's very washed out. Now you got this super hyper digitalization of it, and you can watch a golf course and see the individual blades of grass. When the Spanish-American War was over, they took and they wanted to show there was something, a very, very important event. And so they overprinted it. So they printed the paper and they overprinted it with peace, hurrah, the war is now over. It was not a very long war, it was a very short war. But this sort of, the Spanish-American War really marked the end of the Spanish as the prominent military power in the world. The beginning of that came in 1588. 300 years later, the end came with the Battle of Manila Bay and the Spanish-American War. The beginning of the end came with the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Let's do 471. Big banner headline in 1920. Does anybody have a 1920, September 1920 women got the vote. That was when Tennessee was the last state to ratify the suffrage amendment. The president who was elected in November of 1920 was William, Harding.
Yes, it was on.
Harding is probably one of the worst presidents we've ever had. Anybody want to guess why Harding was elected?
Yeah, it was good looking.
He was a good-looking guy. He was a terrible president. He was awful. He was a real cad, actually. But the women voted for him.
And wasn't there a scandal?
Yes, it was a big scandal. He had a mistress that he was,
Teapot Dome.
I forget the name of it.
Teapot.
Was it Teapot Dome?
Yes, that's.
Well, Teapot Dome,
No, that was.
but that was, there was a sex scandal with
That's
Harding.
right, yes.
He had his mistress coming. It was Monica Lewinsky in 1920 is what it was. But anyway, I would show you just the difference between an 18th century newspaper and 19th century newspaper.
So they got,
Now, interesting enough, I actually brought this up in a lecture I gave about 5 or 6 years ago. And I got some blowback from some of the women in the audience about the fact that why would women vote for somebody who was so handsome? If they had a woman who was running, who was in a bikini for president in 1920, and the guys were the ones who were voting for him, I assure you, he would have won. She would have won. No question about it. Sex sells, it just does.
Were there that many pictures of it?
I'm sorry?
Were there that many pictures of him then?
Yes, oh yeah, at that time you had, you had photographs, and he was a very handsome guy, very smooth talker, very, very suave guy. He just was a cad.
Wasn't he a newspaper man?
He was he actually ran the Marion newspaper in Marion, Indiana, Marion, Ohio. 495. I'm going to end this with a paper that is arguably one of the most in-demand newspapers of the 20th century, and that is Doing Things Straight. And the reason why this is so important is not because of that, it's because of this photograph.
Yeah.
When Truman held up a newspaper of Dewey defeats Truman, and this is really what brought it to the fore and to the consciousness of the country. Being a dentist, Murray, do you notice he's missing his upper right first line?
Nice to see you for that.
This actually was Murray's patient.
I sent it to you, but.
Well, why don't you turn that off and I'll answer any questions. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I didn't get to the moon landing or Lindbergh or things like that, but I'll try, maybe I'll do that next semester, sometime in the summer or spring. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask either on the screen or here in person? Yes.
I have a question. Since you did dentistry so long, is there any paper that you ever found that had anything to do with dentistry?
Yes.
And that you
The
were excited?
question was, did I ever have a paper that I found that had anything to do with dentistry? I found a paper from 1789 with a front page ad of George Washington's dentist.
No, it's wooden teeth.
His teeth were not wood.
No, that's what you said.
They were hippopotamus bone, as I recall.
That cadaver.
What was it? It's like a ivory. It was.
It was kind of ivory, yeah.
Yeah, from some animal. Could have been.
Yeah.
I don't think it was hippopotamus.
He had several sets of teeth.
He
Did he
did
have
have,
some that were
he did have several. His teeth, his denture, one of his dentures, the lower denture, I believe, was in the Smithsonian.
Yes.
They may still have it. And I know they exhibited it at the University of Maryland National Museum of Dentistry.
It had, the teeth were wired to like a gold pallet
Yes.
with little, wires that, with holes in the pallet. And I don't know how they
Well,
kept it.
interestingly, this is why you never, if you take a look at portraits of George Washington, you'll never see him smile.
I don't know.
He suffered from periodontal disease his entire life. And I believe he had his last tooth extracted right before he was president. He had one tooth that held his lower complete denture. It's hard to believe that a person who's really had pain all of his life in his feet could be as accomplished as he was.
Right.
It really was amazing, it really was.
His breath must have been.
Too bad they didn't have root canal specialists back then. Could have,
He died some sort of tooth incision or something. What did he
I
die?
think, Gary.
he went out riding on December the 12th on a horse to survey his property. And his wife, Martha, told him, don't go out, it's too cold out. And he said, oh, just go inside, I'll take care of it. And he rode around to check his crops or to check the animals. And he came back, and the next day he woke up, he had a sore throat. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And they called the doctors, and the doctors bled him. And they kept bleeding him, and bleeding him, and bleeding him. And eventually he died.
Yeah.
Couldn't sue.
There's a very famous report by Tobias Lear, who was his private secretary, and it was printed in the newspapers later on, early in 1799. Well, he was born in 1732, so he was 68.
Yeah.
But it's amazing he lived for that long.
Fairly old for that.
Yeah, for that time he was. Anybody out there in video land have a question you want to ask? No? Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for attending. And don't forget about the Christmas party on April the 3rd at the Academy Art Museum, starting at 3:30, and it will be free food for all.
Are you doing anything in the next